Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this next event in the Europe in Crisis series. Delighted once again to welcome Professor Dominique Moisi, who is here to give the second of his series of lectures on the triumph of fears, and he's speaking this evening on Western fears versus Asian fears. Dominique, over to you.
Thank you. To summarize very, very briefly, a month ago in my introductory lecture, I emphasized the triumph of fear and the feeling, more or less, all over the planet of losing control over one's environment, or in the reverse, of being much too controlled. And we've seen in the last few weeks this sense of deepening control extending. Today, my task would be to try to distinguish between the nature of fear in the Western world and the nature of fear in the Asian world. In a way, the gist of it could be, tell me what you are afraid of, I will tell you who you are. And of course, you have to distinguish between the essence of the West. Is the European West different when it comes to fear from the American West? Can you speak of Asian fear? I can distinguish very clearly fear in China and fear in Japan that are extremely different. Wouldn't you be going as far as saying that when it comes to emotion, Japan is more Western than Asians? By the end of the day, when you start asking these questions, you are asking yourself about the origins of fear. Are they the result of history, culture, geography? What makes a certain part of the world fearful at a particular moment? Because I'm a European, I will use European fears as a kind of measuring stick through which I will compare the other fears that can exist. And in Europe, I think today there are three particular prevalent kind of fears. The first one is to be invaded by the poorest, mostly coming from the south, i.e. Africa or the Middle East. The second fear is the fear to be left behind by the most dynamics, and they are mostly coming from Asia. And the third fear is the fear to be blown up by the most fanatics, which can come from the Middle East or which can be your own children. We have seen that in London in the attacks of 2005. And these three fears interact with each other, percolate with each other to create a climate of angst that is prevailing in the European continent. At the same time, there are differences between the fear of the French, the fear of the German, the the fear of the Pole, the fear of the Greeks. Each member of the European Union has its own variation of fear. In some ways, to understand the variation of fear in Europe, I would make use of a movie that was very popular, in particular in Great Britain, nearly 20 years ago. That movie was called 4 Weddings and a Funeral. The star of that movie was Hugh Grant. Today, in Europe, you are witnessing what I would call 4 divorces. And I hope no funeral, but the British will play a great role in that final diagnosis. The first divorce, and I emphasize those divorces because they are all directly or indirectly the product of fear. The first divorce is the divorce that exists between European citizens and the European Union, between the European citizens and the European project. The fear factor will play a prevailing role in May 2014 in the next European elections. According to all public opinion polls, the level of abstention will be very high, and the percentage of votes obtained by the populist, ultra-rightist, anti-European party will be very high. In my country, France, some people are even thinking that the National Front, the extreme rightist party, will come first in these elections. A very paradoxical result, because those who are the most against Europe are, of course, those who are going to vote most to express their rejection of the European Union. And in this alienation towards the European Union, you see the combination of many factors. One of them is the rejection of decisions that appear at the same time dictatorial and anonymous. Someone without a face reaches a compromise that is imposed on you without discussion. That compromise may be the right one, may be inevitable, but because it's so anonymous, it is rejected with absolute fury. I mean, we see that right now, as I speak, in the west of France, Brittany, where a failing industry, the meat industry, especially when it comes to chicken, is rebelling against Brussels, refusing to give subvention to an industry that failed to modernize and become competitive. But this combination between the dictatorial nature of the decision and the anonymous nature of the people who decide enlarge the gulf that may be existing between citizens and the European Union. The anonymous nature of the project is reinforced by the fact that European elites are focusing on the how to do Europe and no longer concentrate on the why to do it. So there is a feeling at the same time of excessive control that interfere with your life, and a lack of control because you see masses of immigrants reaching your shores and no one being in charge of defining a common European policy vis-à-vis these immigrants. We need them, but we fear them. An aging continent has no policy towards this afflux of immigrants. This is the first divorce, which is very illustrative of this dual fear of excessive control on the one hand and lack of control on the other hand. The second divorce, which is characteristic of the European situation right now, is the divorce that is growing between the situation of France and Germany. The French are afraid, deeply afraid, of seeing themselves not playing any longer in the same league as the Germans. There was, all along the life of the European Union, a kind of balance of imbalances between France and Germany. This has stopped to exist. And the French are suddenly afraid of seeing in the result of the Germans a mirror reflecting their failures, their lack of success in the competitive business. The third divorce that is existing within the European Union is clearly the divorce that exists between Nordic Europe and Southern Europe. The fear of the North to be stopped, slowed down deeply in their success by the failure of the South, and the fear of the South to be imposed austerity measures upon them who are already deeply suffering by selfish, successful Northern Europeans. And in a way, this is the heart, the gist of the problem. There is more Europe today than there ever was in the history of Europe. More institutions linking us, binding us. But there is much less Europeans and Europeanness. The Germans don't feel responsible for the Greek. The Italian would be furious if they were to be compared with the Greeks. And they would be right in that matter. And so there is that sense that suddenly there is a divorce which is cultural, based on geography, at the very moment you would need a sense of unity. But the dual fear of the have against the have-not, and of the have-not against the have, is making progress much, much more difficult. And then there is a fourth divorce that is deepening, that concerns you directly, and that is, of course, the divorce between Great Britain and Europe. More and more British elites are convinced that there will be a referendum in 2017. And they are worried, if they feel pro-European, about the result of that referendum and the consequences that it would entail for the entire European Union. So let's look whether these European fears can be reproduced when it comes to the other side of the Atlantic, i.e., the United States. Well, they do exist, but with a different emphasis. The variations are quite significant and quite logical. I think the American fear of being flooded, invaded by the poorest is much less significant for two obvious reasons. One is geography. It's much more difficult, unless you are a Mexican, to enter into the United States than it is to enter into the European Union. Second, there is, of course, the American tradition of the melting pot, a more welcoming attitude towards migrants that are openly recognized as a key to the success of the American economy. The number of new Americans who are successful in the new economy, in the new technology, that have created a startup that are successful is proportionally much higher than the number of immigrants themselves, especially if they come from Asia, but even if they come from Latin America and are Hispanics. So that first fear is much less visible in the United States, though, of course, it is very present in the attitude of the Tea Party, which is very close in reality to parties like the National Front in France. They pretend to be based at their core on the rejection of the state intervention over the economy, too much government. But in reality, careful studies that have been made of the Tea Party reveal that it's not too much government they resent. It's too much people of a different origin, of a different color of skin. It is racism and xenophobia that is the real motor of those people, of those who support the Tea Party. The second fear, the fear to be left behind by the most dynamic. Here again, it is much less present in the United States than it is in Europe. And here again, for obvious reasons, the United States economy is globally, with maybe the exception of the Federal Republic of Germany, more successful than the economies of the majority of European countries. The level of growth is not spectacular, but it's not in the same category as Europe. There is in America a sense that the dynamism, the flexibility, the individualism, the cult of excellency which exists in the United States of America will take care of the problem of competitiveness. The Americans still feel in charge. Of course, they have huge problems: deficit, debts, the dysfunctional nature of their political system. But nevertheless, they don't fear that much the fact that they can be left behind by others. What they fear, even more so than Europeans, and it's present in their policy, is of course the fear to be blown up by the most fanatics. And 9/11 is, of course, the key explanation for that factor. But in reality, when you look at the relative schizophrenia of the United States towards the rest of the world, the willingness to control whatever is happening, one must go beyond 9/11 and search for deeper, more ancient, historical, cultural roots. I mean, I still remember very vividly an experience I had in New York in January 2002, when I was asked at the Davos World Economic Forum to chair a meeting between the heads of security services of the world. Not all were present, but they were, the most important countries were there. In particular, the Big Five, the Anglo-Saxon, who are supposed to share everything with each other. And I still have in my ears the tone of reproach, frustration of the other Anglo-Saxon representative who were saying to the American, we are giving you everything we have. You don't. There is in the American culture, linked to the sense of mission that animates America, a sense that with responsibilities come rights and not only duties. That it is the sovereign right of America to exert control on others, all others, be they foes or friends alike. And at some point, this sense of right goes berserk, goes much too far. And out of this combination of fear and entitlement comes a huge crisis. I mean, in London last week, a top American former leader in the field of defense was saying, technology gives us the means to control everyone, every time. And technology will give us even more sophisticated tools tomorrow. But is it wise to use them? And this is the key issue. I mean, in the case of the United States of America, Barack Obama in 2008 was to some extent elected by the party of the fear of fear, by those who resented the 8 years of Bush, George W. Bush, which were dominated by a culture of fear, which led America to dubious adventures, especially in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan. And today, one has the feeling that in reality, though Barack Obama won in 2008, the party of fear continues to be prevalent in the United States. And this is a risk for the soft power of America. The image of America is damaged by this emotional reality. For people of my generation, the United States of America was the land of freedom, the country that helped to maintain Europe a free continent at the time of the Cold War. For people of the generation of my children, America tends to be seen more and more as Big Brother, as the country that spies on you without any shame. And when the culture of the life of others, you remember that great movie made in Germany about the Stasi reality in the German Democratic Republic, meets the culture of the 3 days of the Condor, you have a cultural clash, which we see at work between Angela Merkel, that comes from Eastern Germany, and the United States of America. One has to replace American fears within the global context of a country that used to feel the undisputable, unique #1 in the world, and who is now partially obsessed with its relative decline. I mean, the Europeans are asking themselves, who are we? Between North and South, between citizens and Brussels, whatever. Americans are asking themselves, what has happened to us? What has happened to the position, the image, the respect we've had in the world? And it is this combination of revelation of what is perceived as excessive control and doubts about the capabilities of the United States to continue to exert their role, which is creating that very, very dangerous moment. One would accept more, probably, the control America is exerting upon us if that was accompanied by a sense we can't do without them. We're glad they're here. But this is no longer the case. If we move from the West to the East, there is one country which appears as in between. And that's, of course, Russia, which is geographically half European, half Asian. But when it comes to fear, is a strange combination. In fact, xenophobia is much deeper, much more preoccupying in Russia than it is either in the West or in the countries I'm going to look at, China and Japan. There is a sense of being threatened from the inside and from the outside that to a large extent is used, manipulated by the regime, but is shared by a large portion of the Russian population. You have to be nationalistic because the enemy is within you as much as outside of you. You should be glad a strong man is in charge. Otherwise, you would be left alone with those very numerous and very ideological adversaries. Let's move to Asia. And let's try to see whether the measuring sticks that existed in Europe can fit the Asian models. I will start with Japan. Japan has been very often described as the Asian West. It has the democracy, the capitalist system, the modernity that are very often associated with the West. And it has something more than that, which is, since the late 80s, a sense of crisis, a sense that history is not moving the way of Japan it did before. It has a lot to do with the aging of the Japanese population, which resemble the aging situation of the European continent. But in spite of that, there is something very fundamentally different, which is alerting us to a new dimension of fear. And that is not fear of man, but fear of nature. In the 1970s, a book was published in Japan which became an instant bestseller. The title of the book was The Japanese and the Jews. And there's still a mystery as to the author of this book, who wrote it. He understood too well the culture of the two subjects he was dealing with. Who was he really? And the book opens with a chapter on fear. The Japanese, says the writer, fear nature above all. It's normal, given their geography, which is both insular and volcanic. No one can come to invade them, but the nature in itself moves sufficiently to warrant fear of its movement. And it described the Japanese attitude. Whenever you go to bed, you have your lamp, your torch, you are prepared for the worst. The Jews are not afraid of nature. They are afraid of what other men can do to them. They don't have, says the writer, the luxury of being afraid of what nature can do to them. They are so obsessed with the reality of what other men can do to them. In Japan, in the last few years, we have added another fear, which is not only the fear of nature, but the fear of what man's action can do to nature, or what will be the impact of nature on the imprudence of man. And that is, of course, the Fukushima tragedy. Man has played with nature by building houses much too close to the shore, and nature has taken its revenge. But now, if you look at Japanese psyche and Japanese feelings and emotions right now, you see that they share something in common with the Chinese, which is reminiscent of what existed very strongly in Europe a century ago. And that is, of course, the fear of war, in the most classical sense of the term. In Asia, no construction like the European Union has brought about a process of reconciliation within Asian nations. And so somewhere there is a growing fear that 1913 in Asia, not 2013 in Asia, might just become a repetition of 1913 in Europe. Are we in the year that preceded the war? And you see suddenly Japanese, Chinese, I will come to them, rushing to study European history to see whether they can infer from those history books lessons for their present. And there is one book that strikes very much Japanese and Chinese alike. It has just been published by Margaret Macmillan. It's called The War That Ended Peace. And it's a study of the causes of World War I. The writer of the book asked herself, but by the end of the day, what created the war? And she comes with no answer. She can't say, this is this or this is that. No country in particular is uniquely responsible for the war. But she says something, which is that by the end of the day, what made the war more likely than not was the fact that the great leaders which existed before had disappeared. The generation of Bismarck and Salisbury was no longer there. People like Bethmann Olveg were not of the same dimension. And they asked themselves, are the Xi Jinping or the Abe closer to Bismarck and Salisbury or closer to Bethmann Olveg? And they come very quickly to the conclusion that unfortunately they are much closer to the second one who went to war than to the first one who didn't go to war. And so there is that sense that in fact the most classical kind of fear, the fear of war, returns with some kind of vengeance. No one wants war. No one has a plan to invade the other. But are people sufficiently good to make sure that an escalation will not by accident lead to a result no one wanted? I cross the sea and I go to China. When you look at the Chinese, there is, I quote another book, which was published not long ago. And of course, losing my notes. It's called Restless Empire, China and the World since 1750. It was written, can I quote the name of the author, because he teaches at London School of Economics. You are very, the sense of tolerance at King's, I wouldn't doubt it. His name is Odd Arne Vestad. He comes from Nordic Europe. And he emphasized two modern Chinese fear. For him, the Chinese leadership in Beijing is obsessively fearful of both political deviance at home and ethnic and religious dissonance, because they know that their power to govern the economy is limited, even if growth continues at a reduced but relatively high rate, they insist on controlling the political sphere. I can't allow the political sphere not to be fully controlled by myself, because I know tomorrow the economy will take a life of its own. I will be less and less able to control it. So let me stick to that control of the political sphere. And in a way that leads them to exert a control that is damaging for their self-image, and even more so for their image in the world. The soft power of China is being damaged by the excessive fear of the Chinese regime over its ability to control its citizens. In fact, the fear of the regime to see the political deviance of their citizen is matched by the fear of citizens of seeing their regime not capable of controlling pollution and ecological catastrophes. You control my life, what I think, in a way that is absurd, because I'm not a danger to you. But you are not protecting me from the ecological disasters that you are producing. I want more control of the state over my health, my daily life, and less control of the state over what I may be thinking or what I may be wishing for politically. And this weekend, there will be a Congress of the Communist Party in Beijing that will open. And people are already starting to compare this party congress with previous ones. Some, the most optimistic, say, well, this is 1978, that starts again. We'll see the most decisive Congress since Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978. Others are saying just the reverse. It is not going to be that way. In fact, the regime is very prudent and will not introduce the reforms that are necessary. In fact, I would say that citizens in China would be much less fearful if there was the slow introduction of rule of law measures. They don't want democracy, except for very small minority of Chinese. But they want the rule of law. They see the consequences of the absence of the rule of law on their daily life, and that they cannot accept any longer. If we summarize all these fears and try to come to a conclusion, because I realize I've been speaking for my time, which has elapsed at least, let me try to find out how it fits. On the one hand, in a global age, in a world that is both interdependent and transparent, you would expect fears to be of some kind of universal nature. We live in the same planet, confronted with the same challenges. And the measuring sticks of Europe do apply with different values, with different emphasis to all the continents. There is the fear of the other. There's the fear of terrorism. There is the fear of unfair economic competitiveness. The fear that you are not going to make it. The fear that someone else is in control of your destiny. And yet, you realize that some strange association emerge. To some extent, European fears and Chinese fears could look relatively similar, with something else, which is the fact that China and Europe are united by a common desire not to take global responsibilities. The desire for powerlessness, which is rising in Europe behind the growth of Germany, is matched by the desire not to exert responsibility, which is very present in China. In the case of the United States, there is still a remnant of the exceptionalist factor, which is present deeply in the American culture. I have a different role. I have a different role to play. And therefore, I remain unique in my approach to the world, and relatively unique in my combination of fears of the world. More extreme in wanting to control the rest, much less prevalent when it comes to internal domestic fears. Next time, we'll move to the Middle East and try to see whether the concept of fears in the Middle East are of a very different nature from what they are between the West and the East. Thank you.
Dominique. Thank you very much indeed for what was an enormously wide-ranging survey. We've got about half an hour for questions and comments now. If that's okay with you. Who would like to start us off? Yes, please.
In this extremely complex world, we have been trying to solve problems by not looking enough at the whole system, but looking at corners and trying to solve problems and thus creating problems. So this gap between knowledge and action has been growing fast. It's growing faster and faster. So shouldn't we be addressing that?
Yes. But in a way, I'm not sure what you mean by your question. But I'll tell you what I understand by your question. And you may tell me it has nothing to do with what you had in mind. In a way, we are inundated, obscured by datas and brightness. We receive so many informations at the same time. We live permanently under so much light that somewhere we can't distinguish between what is fundamental and what is superficial, what is just trendy and what is a trend. But is that what you had in mind?
Yes, in a way. In one part of this college, King's College, there's one area, a learning and teaching area, where they say we need to have a concept map in front of us so that we can have all these factors that are impinging on each other in a very complex way, so that we are aware of all the factors and when we solve problems. So I'm very sorry to be very rude, but I've been going to LSE, all sorts of universities every day because I'm a Sri Lankan Tamil. I have got a lot of problems to solve, so I'm going all these places. I can't see a concept map when such huge problems are discussed. I'm very sorry, I'm very rude, but
No,
that's me, yes.
No, but
I was a teacher, and I am very much interested in having a concept map in front of me to discuss problems.
no, but what I'm trying to say in this course is that I've seen, as a Westerner, the prevalence of the emotion of fear gaining ground in the last few years. I'm trying to analyze it in order to resist it. I contrast that prevalence of fear with some extraordinarily good news. But I don't know whether I told you last time, but I was at Oxford not long ago. A professor of demographics spoke for half an hour and concluded his speech by saying, by just listening to me, you've gained 22 minutes of life. Because the life expectancy is growing at a rate unheard of in past history. So there are a lot of good things. We know we are going to be able to solve illness, to solve a lot of problems. Nevertheless, the majority of people in the part of the world I come from see the dark side and not the bright side. And I'm trying to understand why. And I look in other cultures and I see that there is equally a sense of pervading fear. Where does it come from? What are the sources of it? What makes people fearful of the future? And one of the reasons is that there's no, as you said, a project, a vision. In the case of Europe, Anand and myself have been Europhile, pro-European, for a very, very long period of time. And we keep asking ourselves every day, what has happened to our dream? How can we resuscitate our dream? And so one way of looking at it is precisely to say, well, are other people dreaming today? Or do they all have more nightmares than dreams? And why is it so?
Question over there.
Question about some of the terms or facts. You used a lot of terms of collective nature, like just to give an example, something I'm familiar with, Chinese, like Chinese have fears like this or that, or just try to understand, like, what does it mean Chinese? You mean 90% of Chinese? You mean the elites? You mean the majority? You mean what does it mean, the Chinese, and what does it mean they have fears for they? Who are they? Are you talking about some villagers? Are you talking about, people in the city, like 90% of the people? I mean, what does it mean?
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's the subject is so broad that if I start to distinguish, I can't simply in 5 lectures do it. So there is a certain artificiality in the simplification of it. It's clear that I'm not sure a villager in China is thinking of 1914 and what happened in Europe. But my Chinese colleagues in Beijing have been telling me for years that the leaders of China have asked their experts to write a report on German diplomacy between 1890 1914, lessons for China. These are the Chinese, of course, I have in mind, and I should have been much more specific. But when you ask such a study, first it shows an ability to think long term in the past and in the future. Second, it shows also that you are deeply aware that what happened in Germany more than a century ago still has a lot of meaning for you. To be brutal and simple, the Bismarck line, keep a low profile. You are too powerful today not to keep a low profile, was the line of Deng Xiaoping. And the line of Wilhelm II, let's show the world what we have become, is the line chosen, preferred by some of the people who succeeded Deng Xiaoping. And I must say, as a Westerner, I would love to see in the Élysée Palace, in 10 Downing Street, or in the White House, people in charge looking at the world and saying to their experts, what can I learn from these experiences? And I can tell you, there's no equivalent, no comparison. But you're right. When I say the Chinese, I have in mind the reflective elite. But then, of course, I moved to, when I tried at some point, if you remember what I said, I spoke of Chinese government and Chinese people. Chinese people saying, I would like less control over my life politically and more control over the air I breathe. That you can read every day.
Professor, first of all, thank you very much for the comprehensive and sometimes desperate briefing about the fears. I'm from Royal College of Defense Studies, and we try to find out a solution, possible ways of solving the problem. And here we heard the fears for divorced within the European Union. And no, we are not expecting the French and the Germans love each other day after tomorrow. Neither we expected the British believe in the European Union next Monday. But I would like to ask you, where do you see the solutions or possible way of solving not all of them, but majority of the problems? Thank you.
Well, the traditional answer is more Europe is the solution to the problems of Europe. We have become to be more integrated. We need stronger, tighter institutions. Rationally, it may be right, but politically, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. How can you impose more integration to citizens who are already rejecting Europe? I think the solution can only come from the various national capitals of Europe. The solution to the problems of Brussels is in Paris, Berlin, London. Citizens will be reconciled with the European Union if they are reconciled with their identity first, as Frenchmen, as British, whatever. And that's the first answer. It's not more Europe, it's better national governments. The second answer seems slightly to contradict the first one. And it is linked to the issue of incarnation. Europe is disincarnated. The leaders of Europe have been chosen by Paris, London, Berlin, according to their limits and not according to their merits. They didn't want rivals. And because they didn't get rivals, Europe is really losing steam in the eyes of its citizens. I mean, someone, I will not give the name, but was very well known as a key actor in the European game for decades, once told me Jacques Delors was chosen as the head of the Commission because no one knew him. Barroso was chosen as head of the Commission because everybody knew him and was re-elected, re-nominated because everybody knew him. And I think you need more gravitas in the various capitals of Europe, more seriousness, more responsibility. I mean, one of the key problems in the Franco-German couple is that since François Mitterrand, no French president has been a match for a German chancellor. It's not a question of right or left. It's a question of reforms that have not been made, of lack of courage to face the situation.
Do you mind if I ask you a question? Which is, I mean, your analysis is based on space, it's based on geography, us against them, us over here, them over there. But my question relates to a more temporal factor, and I think a divorce you might have missed, which seems to me crucial for how politics will develop over time, and that's the divorce between generations. And I think that's probably particularly Western, but I think it's going to be absolutely fundamental to how our politics develops, which is the sort of the selfishness of the baby boomers and the way in which the baby boomers have, if you like, taken everything. Wealth, you know, we have the pensions, we have the jobs, we have the houses, we have the security, leaving to our children a world where all those securities have gone. And we're kind of building a world of fear for the next generation by insulating ourselves from that fear. And I wonder if that has any space in your analysis, that intergenerational aspect.
Yes, I thank you for that. One answer would be to say, the older you get, the more fearful you are. Because you sense the end of your presence on this planet. And Europe is aging. And so there is less hope for natural, biological reasons. But at the same time, the reverse is true, in the sense that my generation, which is coming to retirement, had it very easy. When I graduated in 1967, the level of unemployment in my country was extremely low. People took to the streets because they were bored with the system. That's May 68. If people take to the streets in Europe, it is because they want to enter the system. And there are no jobs for them. You say there are no jobs for them because the generation of baby boomers has been very selfish. I would say there are no jobs for them because the leadership has been lacking imagination. I mean, I was seeing yesterday a very fascinating program on French television on German industry and the greatness of flexibility. You could see people retired, over 65, returning to work for 2-3 days without a real long-term contract, simply because they were needed to teach young people how to do things. And you had the example of an intergenerational successful system. Young people were too few, not enough were available in the middle age to teach the young one, so you would take the old one. And instead of having to recreate a job, a line of contract that would make it very difficult, you simply gave them the opportunity to be useful. They were so happy. I would say these people are going to live longer because they were not rejected by society. They were given a role. So in a way, is it a question of generation or is it a question of leadership? It's probably in between.
Yeah.
Sir, at the other side of the Atlantic, John Mearsheimer has his very famous assertion that China cannot rise peacefully simply because as China rises, China would want to seize more power. But today, you said that Europe and China share the same desire of not taking responsibilities in this work. So could you please shed more light on
Yeah.
this? Thank you.
Well, I don't think, but I may be wrong, that the ambition of China in the world is to replace the United States, to be the number one power, the hyperpower, the superpower of tomorrow. I don't think they ever had that ambition, historically speaking. One reason for that absence of universal ambition is a sense of cultural confidence in their civilization. Why do I have to show the world I'm number one? I am number one. I'm the oldest civilization on Earth. I've always been there. And historians of China are explaining the famous China Wall not by the ambition of China, but in a way the prudence of China. What is on our side of the wall is ours, but beyond, it has to be stable. We are concerned, but we don't want to rule over. So kind of self-limitation demonstrated by the very existence of the Great Wall. I believe in that, which does not mean that regionally the rise of nationalist tendencies or the use of nationalist tendencies cannot become dangerous. I mean, when you are playing with Navy ship armed with very sophisticated weapons in a very close sea, and where no one, neither on the Chinese nor on the Japanese side, have been used to war, you run the risk of accidents. That is something very different. The risk of war has nothing to do with the ambition of China to replace the United States of America as the world's most powerful strategic force. In fact, according to some economic studies, China will be number one economically as early as 2020. But that does not entice a Chinese ambition to dominate the world. And it's good they don't have that ambition, because I don't think the United States of America would allow them to have that ambition.
Professor, in the wake of the Second World War and during the Cold War, the hegemony of the United States was clear. It had a clear mission. And in the wake of the Second World War and the need to rebuild the continent politically and economically, the European Union, too, had a clear mission. You've indicated that currently within China there's a looking back to the causes of the First World War in terms to shape current policy. So the question is, do we actually need fear? Isn't it being fear which has given the mission a sense of confidence in these nations, which has allowed them, in many cases, to build multinational institutions which have been beneficial?
Yeah, but the question is different. It's not whether we need fear, but whether we have fear. And I think fear is a natural instinct, which is key to survival. Without fear, your chance of living are reduced. But with excessive fear, your chance of living harmoniously are being reduced too. So this is the very nature of fear is particular. This is the emotion that controls you, and not an emotion you control. I mean, there are a lot of emotions you can control. When General de Gaulle is said to have been saying when he enters Notre-Dame de Paris, the day Paris is liberated, I feel myself seized with a calculated emotion. So he distantiates himself from the emotion he feels in order to use it vis-à-vis the citizens of Paris to project his greatness, his grandeur. But fear, you cannot manipulate. You can manipulate the emotion of fears, but if you feel it, it controls you.
Oh, Dominique, I fear we've reached the end of
You
our
are
time.
afraid.
Yes. I've stupidly not written down the date of your next lecture. I think it's December the 11th
Yes.
from memory. The
Everything you
third of
want
the
to know
series.
about the Middle East.
Yes, there'll be plenty of fears to keep us going there, I fear. But just finally, to thank you very, very much indeed for your wonderful talk this evening and
Thank
for
you.
answering questions. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next time.